Talking about the law can be a challenge in any language. When an attorney and her client speak different languages, the difficulties can multiply. Here are some basic tips, however, that can help an attorney communicate effectively to a client. Through an interpreter. What is interpretation? Interpretation is converting oral or signed messages from one language to another while keeping the original meaning. An interpreter converts a message from a source language to one in a target language. Interpretation is different from translation, where a written message is changed from one language to another. Interpretation is needed when an attorney has a client who only has a limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. In other words, a limited English proficient, or LEP client. Interpretation is also needed when an attorney has a client who is deaf or hard of hearing. Why use an interpreter? To communicate. Sometimes an LEP, deaf, or hard of hearing client may be able to answer a few basic and common questions in the attorney's language, but an interpreter will be necessary when more complicated legal concepts are being discussed. Even if an attorney and a client can communicate in a shared language, an interpreter will be necessary when the attorney and client both need to communicate with others who don't share the language, such as at court. The attorney should never be both attorney and interpreter. Sometimes a client and attorney may need a relay interpreter who understands the client's language and speaks to a second interpreter who can communicate to the attorney, and vice versa. Why use an interpreter? It's required. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act requires programs that receive federal funding to have language access services, such as interpreters. An attorney's ethical duties of competent representation and communication with her client may require it. Using an interpreter is also mandated by the American Bar Association Standards for Provision of Civil Legal Aid, Legal Services Corporation Program Guidance, and provisions in some private contracts and grants. Other laws and regulations may also require interpreters. For example, American Sign Language interpretation for deaf and hard of hearing clients is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1974, Section 504, and other state and federal laws. What makes a qualified interpreter? A lot of skills. An interpreter must have a high proficiency in both the source and target languages. Okay, so what's high proficiency? An interpreter must be fluent in both languages, and also thoroughly understand both languages, legal jargon and technical terms, grammatical conventions, appropriate registers, formal, informal, or casual, slang, colloquial phrases, and idioms. A highly proficient interpreter should be able to interpret in whatever mode is most appropriate. So what do you mean by mode? The mode depends on who's speaking and whether the LEP, deaf, or hard of hearing person is being directly addressed or just meant to observe without responding. For example, consecutive interpretation is where the interpreter listens to the speaker's source message and then addresses the listener in the target language immediately after the utterance. This mode is commonly used when the LEP, deaf, or hard of hearing person needs to answer questions. In contrast, simultaneous interpretation is where the interpreter is speaking in the target language almost at the same time as the source message is being spoken. This mode is commonly used when the listener isn't being addressed directly, but needs to know what others are saying. Sometimes simultaneous interpretation requires special equipment, like headphones and a microphone. Sight translation is where the interpreter reads aloud in the target language from a document that is written in the source language. It is a hybrid of translation and interpretation, but highly proficient interpretation requires more than just being bilingual and knowing the right words. An interpreter should speak quickly and without hesitation, retaining the speaker's register and with correct pronunciation and correct inflection. So what else makes a qualified interpreter? Credentials. When working with an interpreter in legal settings, the most relevant credential is court certification. Some interpreters may be certified to work in the medical field, for example, but not in the legal field. Most state courts have certification programs for court interpreters. More information about the different court requirements can be found at www.ncsc.org. For example, Washington's State Court Interpreter Program is operated by the Administrative Office of the Courts, or AOC. Washington certifies interpreters in certain spoken languages. Washington also registers interpreters in many more languages. However, sometimes a client needs an interpreter in a language that Washington neither certifies nor registers. In this case, the attorney will have to independently qualify the interpreter by asking a series of questions. So what is a certified interpreter? Washington currently offers certification in 11 languages. To get certified, an interpreter must pass a written exam with multiple choice questions about legal terms and ethics, and translate several passages. The interpreter must also pass an oral exam demonstrating ability in all three modes of interpreting, and must pass a criminal background check, must take an oath, must get an official badge, and must keep up with continuing education requirements. So what is a registered interpreter? Washington offers another type of exam for about 50 other languages for which certification is not available. To get registered, an interpreter has to pass the same requirements as the certification process, except the oral exam is different. Whereas the certification oral exam tests all the modes of interpreting, to get registered, the applicant must pass a telephonic interview that only tests oral proficiency and not interpreting skills. So what is an independently qualified interpreter? Washington has not set up a process to assess interpreters for every language an attorney may encounter. If a client speaks a language other than those which have an assessment process, the attorney will have to ask a series of questions to ensure the interpreter is qualified to work in the legal setting. Attorneys should ask about training and experience. For example, when did you learn both languages? Have you been formally trained as an interpreter? The Washington AOC does not certify or register American Sign Language interpreters. There is national certification for ASL interpreters. ASL interpreters obtain certification through a program operated by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf and the National Association of the Deaf. So what makes a qualified interpreter? Neutrality. An interpreter must not have any conflicts of interest. Attorneys should always ask if the interpreter personally knows the client, the other witnesses, or the opposing party, and if so, the attorney should ask questions to ensure the interpreter can remain neutral. It's generally not a good idea to have family members interpret for each other. Sometimes a client won't want to disclose sensitive information to a family member. Family members may have a hard time giving clear and unbiased interpretation. Intentionally or unintentionally, they may skew the communication, especially if there's been a history of family trauma. Some clients may want their children to interpret for them, but it is never appropriate. Attorneys should hire a neutral, proficient, certified interpreter even in private client meetings, so there's no chance that the interpreter can be called as a witness to testify about the attorney-client communication. While unlikely, there is a risk a non-neutral interpreter, like a friend or family member of the client, may count as a waiver of the attorney-client privilege, and the interpreter could be called to testify about the communication. So how should an attorney work with the interpreter? Follow the rules. In court proceedings, local court rules will restrict how the interpreter and attorney should act. Respect the interpreter's role. Attorneys should respect the unique role that interpreters play in the attorney-client relationship. The attorney shouldn't ask the interpreter to try to explain or describe difficult ideas, documents, or legal processes. Attorneys are supposed to explain legal concepts, and interpreters are supposed to interpret those explanations. Attorneys should hold a pre-session with the client and the interpreter so everyone understands the attorney's and interpreter's different roles and ethical duties. Know the interpreter's code of professional conduct. Attorneys should be aware of interpreters' ethical duties. Some of the most common provisions include: interpreters have an ethical duty to interpret everything said to the client without adding or omitting anything. Attorneys should never ask the interpreter not to interpret something. Interpreters have other duties to the client too. They have a duty to keep privileged communication confidential. And the interpreter has a duty to express if they have reservations about whether they can interpret competently, like if they have trouble understanding the client. Respect the client's culture. Attorneys should be aware that some LEP clients are unfamiliar with the United States legal system and should not hesitate to ask questions if it seems like the unfamiliarity is impacting communication. Respect the interpreter's time. Attorneys should schedule longer client meetings when working with an interpreter because of the extra time that interpretation entails. Attorneys should start promptly so as not to waste the interpreter's time and the attorney's own money. Interpreters often have very busy schedules and will leave at the scheduled time, so attorneys should plan accordingly so they don't have to cut their client off in the middle of a meeting because the interpreter has to leave. Attorneys should also give the interpreter time for a break. Interpretation is a complex mental task with little downtime because interpreters must listen and speak twice as much as other people. Know where to sit. Attorneys should know the best way to arrange the seating when working with an interpreter. A spoken language interpreter should sit next to, but slightly behind, the client. An American Sign Language interpreter should sit next to, but slightly behind, the attorney. The client may be naturally inclined to talk to the interpreter who shares his or her language. So if an attorney has to leave the room, the attorney should ask the interpreter to step outside as well, so the client doesn't try to rely on the interpreter for advice. Relearn how to speak. Attorneys should use direct speech when speaking through the interpreter. For example, "Did you do this?" and not, "Ask him if he did this." Attorneys should speak at a normal pace, but in manageable chunks of speech so interpreters don't fall behind. Maintain control of the interview. Attorneys should observe the interpreter's practice closely. An attorney may need to find a new interpreter if it seems like not everything is being interpreted, such as when a long back-and-forth exchange is interpreted as a one-word answer. Know the signs of good interpreting. Counterintuitively, interruption may be a sign of a diligent interpreter if the interpreter asks you to repeat or rephrase something. Good interpreters will often take written notes and ask you a lot of questions for a more precise interpretation. Good interpreters always use direct speech. So how does an attorney find an interpreter? Many legal offices generate their own lists of interpreters, both in person and telephonic. You can search for Washington Court Certified and Registered Interpreters at www.courts.wa.gov. Professional interpreters organizations can be good places to look for membership lists. A new helpful resource will be released soon, an online directory for interpreters and translators at www.wascla.org. Thanks for listening to these tips for attorneys working with interpreters. For more information, check out the following resources online.